Her children sell her house and abandon her, but they are shocked by what they discover. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Evelyn sat on the front porch of her home, a place where every stone, every flower in the garden, held the memories of her life. At 78, her movements were slow, and her vision slightly clouded, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She had raised her two children, Anthony and Julia, within the walls of this house, sharing countless moments of joy, sorrow, and growth. Now they were grown, living their own lives, and she rarely saw them anymore. However, she always believed that no matter the distance, family was bound by an unbreakable love, one that transcended the hustle and bustle of life. Or so she thought. It was a sunny afternoon when Anthony and Julia arrived at the house unexpectedly. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat when she saw them both. She hadn't seen them together in months. For a moment, hope fluttered inside her, thinking perhaps they'd finally come to spend some time with her, to reminisce about old times. "Evelyn," Anthony began, skipping the usual greetings. There was a sharpness in his tone that Evelyn didn't quite recognize. "We need to talk," Julia added, her eyes avoiding Evelyn's. A sense of unease crept into Evelyn's chest, but she masked it with a warm smile. "Of course, come inside. I'll make tea." As the three of them sat in the small living room, surrounded by old photos and mementos, Evelyn noticed something had changed in her children. They seemed distant, even cold. After a few moments of awkward small talk, Anthony finally came out with it. "Mom, we've sold the house." Evelyn blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "What did you say?" "We sold the house," Anthony repeated, his voice firm. "It's been on the market for a while. The papers are finalized." Evelyn felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart pounded. This house, her house, was sold. Without her consent. Without even discussing it with her. "But how?" she stammered. "I didn't agree to sell. This house, it's all I have." "Mom," Julia chimed in, her tone a mixture of frustration and what seemed like guilt. "You're getting older, and you can't take care of this place anymore. We've talked about this. You'll move into a smaller apartment. It'll be better for you. Better for her." Evelyn's mind raced. This wasn't about her well-being. No, this was something else. They had gone behind her back, sold the home she had shared with their father for over 50 years, without so much as a conversation. She felt the sting of betrayal settle deep within her bones. "I didn't agree to this," Evelyn said firmly, her hands trembling as they gripped the armrest of the chair. "We have power of attorney," Anthony said matter-of-factly, as if that simple statement excused all wrongdoing. "It's already done. There's no going back." For a long moment, the room was filled with silence. Evelyn felt as though her world had been ripped away from her. How had it come to this? When had her children, her flesh and blood, become strangers capable of such heartlessness? Finally, Evelyn stood up, her legs unsteady. "I need to be alone." Neither of her children protested. They exchanged a quick glance, mumbled something about how this is for the best, and left the house without a second word. As the door closed behind them, Evelyn sank into her chair, her mind reeling. The house, the one thing that connected her to her late husband, to all the memories of raising their children, was no longer hers. Days turned into weeks, and Evelyn struggled to accept what had happened. She moved into a small, dingy apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't home, and it never would be. The walls were bare, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. Each morning, she woke up with a heaviness in her chest, mourning the loss of not just her house, but the life it symbolized. She tried to reach out to Anthony and Julia, but they were always too busy. There was always an excuse, a meeting, a family obligation, something that kept them from her. As the isolation settled in, Evelyn began to sift through the few belongings she had managed to bring with her. Boxes of old photos, keepsakes, and documents lay scattered around her small living room. One evening, while sorting through these remnants of her past, she came across something she had never seen before. A small, leather-bound diary with her late husband's initials embossed on the cover. How had she never found this before? Curiosity piqued. Evelyn opened the diary and began to read. At first, it was filled with mundane details, entries about their children's milestones, gardening notes, and plans for the future. But then, as she turned the pages, the tone of the writing changed. Her husband had written about things he had kept secret from her. Money troubles, concerns about their children's financial irresponsibility, and finally, a shocking revelation. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she read the final entry. Her husband had set aside a significant amount of money, intending to leave it solely for Evelyn's care. However, Anthony and Julia had discovered this, and in the months before his death, they had somehow convinced him to place the money in a joint account, one that they had full access to after his passing. The truth hit Evelyn like a freight train. Her children hadn't just sold her house out of necessity. They had done it because they had already drained the money her husband had left for her. The betrayal cut deeper than she ever thought possible. They had lied to her, manipulated her, and now they had taken everything she held dear. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. This wasn't the time to cry. This was the time for action. Evelyn couldn't sleep that night. The weight of the discovery gnawed at her like an open wound. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined, and the diary had only scratched the surface. Her children, her own flesh and blood, had not only taken her house but had stolen the money her husband left for her, the man they all once loved. She spent hours staring at the diary, feeling the sharp sting of disillusionment. But her sadness quickly morphed into something else. Anger. Fury pulsed through her veins as she relived every moment of deceit, every lie they had told her. It wasn't just the money or the house. It was the sheer audacity of it all, the cold, calculated manner in which they had stripped her of everything. By dawn, she had made up her mind. This wasn't just about mourning what she'd lost. It was about taking back what was rightfully hers. The following week, Evelyn quietly began her investigation. She wasn't going to confront her children outright. She knew Anthony and Julia too well. They were careful, calculated, and they'd use every legal and manipulative trick in the book to dismiss her claims. No, Evelyn needed evidence. Solid, irrefutable proof of what they had done. Her first step was to contact her late husband's lawyer. Mr. Goodman had been a trusted family friend for decades, and she hoped he might know something about the joint account her children had manipulated. She hadn't spoken to him in years, since her husband's funeral, but she knew he would remember her. After a few formalities on the phone, Mr. Goodman agreed to meet Evelyn the following afternoon at his downtown office. The ride there felt endless, and her hands trembled as she walked into the sleek, glass-walled building. Mr. Goodman greeted her with a warm smile, but as soon as they sat down, she could sense his hesitation. "Evelyn, it's been a while," he began, his tone cautious. "Yes, it has. I wish I could say this was a social visit, but I've discovered some troubling things, and I need your help." Mr. Goodman listened intently as Evelyn recounted her story. The sale of her house, the discovery of her husband's diary, and the suspicion that her children had drained her inheritance. He sat back in his chair, his brows furrowed in thought. "I suspected something was off after your husband's passing," he finally said. "But I never had enough evidence to pursue anything. Your children came to me after his death, claiming they had power of attorney, and they transferred most of your husband's accounts into their names. At the time they said it was to take care of you, but now I see what they were really after." Evelyn felt a cold chill run down her spine. It was worse than she had imagined. "Can we do anything about it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Goodman leaned forward, a spark of determination in his eyes. "We'll need documentation, bank records, transaction histories, everything. But if we can prove they acted without your consent and used your husband's assets for their own gain, we have a case. It won't be easy, but it's possible." For the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They agreed to keep their meetings discreet and to work together to gather the necessary evidence. Over the next few months, Evelyn delved deep into the world of finances and legal matters. With Mr. Goodman's help, she tracked down the records she needed. What they uncovered was a web of deceit. Anthony and Julia had not only sold her house for far less than its worth, but had also funneled the remaining money from the joint account into their personal ventures. They had used her inheritance to pay off their debts, invest in risky business deals, and fund their lavish lifestyles, all while leaving Evelyn to rot in her tiny apartment. As the case against them grew stronger, Evelyn's resolve only deepened. She knew the next step would be the hardest, confronting her children. But it was a confrontation she could no longer avoid. One cold winter evening, Evelyn invited Anthony and Julia to her apartment under the guise of discussing their family's future. She made it sound as though she had come to terms with the sale of the house and was ready to move on. They arrived with little fanfare, and their initial interactions were as distant as ever. "Mom, you wanted to talk?" Julia said, sipping the tea Evelyn had prepared. Her voice was casual, even indifferent. Anthony leaned back in his chair, clearly eager to get this over with. "Yes," Evelyn began, her voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about the house, and I understand why you thought it was the right decision. But there's something I discovered recently. Something I believe you both need to hear." Anthony and Julia exchanged quick, nervous glances. "What is it?" Anthony asked, trying to mask his discomfort. Evelyn took a deep breath and placed her husband's diary on the table. "I found your father's diary. It details everything he wanted for me. How he set aside money for my care, money you both took from me." Julia paled, her eyes widening slightly. Anthony, however, didn't flinch. "Mom, we already talked about this. We had power of attorney. It was all legal." "Was it?" Evelyn cut him off sharply, her voice rising. "Because I have bank records. I know how you drained that account, how you funneled the money into your own pockets. And I know that you sold the house without my consent. You think that because it was legal it was right." Anthony's confidence faltered for the first time. He opened his mouth to speak but said nothing. "You betrayed me," Evelyn continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "You took everything your father and I built together and destroyed it. And now I'm going to make sure the world knows what you've done." The silence that followed was deafening. Julia began to cry, her hands trembling as she covered her face. "Mom, we didn't mean for it to go this far. We thought we were doing what was best for you." "Best for me?" Evelyn's laughter was bitter. "No, you did what was best for yourselves." Anthony, still reeling, finally found his voice. "What do you want, Mom?" "Money. The house. We can't undo what's already done." "I don't want your money," Evelyn spat. "But I will take back what's mine, and I'll make sure you both pay for what you've done." With those words hanging in the air, Evelyn left the room, leaving her children stunned and speechless. It wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of the reckoning they both deserved. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she closed the door behind her, leaving Anthony and Julia in stunned silence. The weight of her words still hung in the air like a heavy cloud, but for the first time since their betrayal, Evelyn felt a sense of control. The final confrontation was still ahead, and it would be more public and decisive than anything they could have imagined. Over the following weeks, Evelyn worked closely with Mr. Goodman to prepare a lawsuit. Her children's deception had left a paper trail of fraud and financial misconduct, enough to pursue legal action that could strip them of everything they had gained at her expense. But more than legal retribution, Evelyn wanted justice, a public reckoning that would force Anthony and Julia to confront the consequences of their greed. The day of the court hearing came faster than Evelyn had anticipated. She stood outside the courthouse, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. Despite the nerves bubbling inside her, she remained resolute. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about setting things right, not just for herself but for the memory of her late husband and the legacy they had built together. Inside the courtroom, Anthony and Julia sat at the defense table, their faces drawn and pale. Gone was their confident, dismissive attitude. In its place was uncertainty, fear of what was to come. Their lawyer, a sharp-eyed man in an expensive suit, looked tense as well. Evelyn could tell that, despite his best efforts, even he couldn't deny the mountain of evidence against them. Mr. Goodman laid out the case with precision. He spoke of how Anthony and Julia had manipulated their mother's trust, draining the funds her husband had intended for her care, and sold the family home without her consent. Document after document was presented, each one a damning testament to their betrayal. As the proceedings unfolded, Evelyn sat quietly, listening to the testimony and watching her children squirm in their seats. She had raised them to be better than this, or at least she had thought she had. But greed had twisted them into something unrecognizable. When it was Anthony's turn to testify, his once confident demeanor had all but evaporated. He stumbled over his words, trying to justify his actions, but the truth was laid bare for all to see. Julia, too, was a shadow of her former self, her eyes downcast as she mumbled through her statements. The judge listened intently, his face unreadable, but as the trial wore on, it became clear where the judgment was heading. The evidence was irrefutable, and Anthony and Julia had no defense for their actions. When the time came for Evelyn to speak, she stood up, her frail but determined frame commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "I trusted my children," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I raised them to respect the values of family, of love, and of trust. But somewhere along the way they lost sight of those values. They chose greed and deception over loyalty and care. And for that I have suffered, but I will not suffer in silence any longer." The courtroom was silent, every eye on Evelyn. Her words were more than just a recounting of the past. They were a final, unshakable declaration that she would no longer be a victim. "As much as it pains me, I have to accept that the children I once knew are gone. They betrayed me, their own mother, and for that, there must be consequences. I am not asking for money, nor am I seeking revenge. I only ask that justice be served, and that the truth be acknowledged." When Evelyn finished, she sat back down, her heart racing, but there was a weight lifted from her shoulders. She had said everything she needed to say, and now the decision was in the hands of the court. The judge adjourned the session, and as everyone filed out of the courtroom, Anthony and Julia remained behind, avoiding their mother's gaze. Evelyn didn't approach them, nor did she expect them to approach her. They were too far gone, and she had accepted that now. A few days later, the verdict came in. The court ruled in Evelyn's favor. Anthony and Julia were ordered to repay every cent they had taken from their mother, and the sale of the house was deemed invalid. The property was to be returned to Evelyn, and her children would receive no inheritance from her late husband's estate. But the final twist was not the legal victory. It was what came next. In the weeks following the trial, Evelyn received a visit from an unexpected guest, a man named David, who introduced himself as a private investigator hired by her late husband before he passed away. He had been following the trail of the joint account her children had drained and had uncovered something far more valuable than the money they had stolen. David handed Evelyn a sealed envelope with her husband's name scrawled on the front. Inside was a letter written in her husband's familiar handwriting, along with a document outlining a trust fund, one that her husband had set up in secret, long before his death. The fund had been hidden in a separate account, untouched by Anthony and Julia's scheming hands. Its purpose: to ensure that Evelyn would never be left without resources, even if their children turned on her. Evelyn's heart pounded as she read the letter, her husband's final words echoing in her mind. "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened. I always feared our children might take advantage of your kindness, and I couldn't bear the thought of you being left with nothing. This trust is my last gift to you, a way to make sure that no matter what, you will always have the life you deserve. I love you now and always." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest. Her husband had known. He had anticipated the betrayal and had taken steps to protect her. Even in death, he had been looking out for her. The trust fund was substantial, more than enough to ensure that Evelyn could live comfortably for the rest of her days. But more than the money, it was the thought behind it that brought her comfort. Her husband had believed in her, had loved her enough to prepare for the worst. And now, even though he was gone, his love was still with her, guiding her through the darkness. In the end, Evelyn chose not to dwell on the bitterness of her children's betrayal. She reclaimed her house, but more than that, she reclaimed her dignity. She spent her days surrounded by the memories of her past, but with a new sense of purpose and peace. The house, once filled with the laughter of family, now stood as a testament to her resilience. As for Anthony and Julia, they were left to deal with the consequences of their actions. The public nature of the trial had tarnished their reputations, and the financial burden of repaying their mother weighed heavily on them. They had lost everything in their pursuit of greed, and Evelyn no longer felt any responsibility for their choices. In the end, Evelyn had not just won a legal battle, she had won back her life. She had been betrayed by those closest to her, but she had emerged stronger, her faith in herself renewed. And though the pain of their betrayal would never fully fade, Evelyn knew that she would never be alone. Her husband's love, the love that had built the foundation of their family, had been with her all along. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.